Okay, well, I see our numbers continuing to rise. So maybe this is a good point to begin. Welcome to today's webinar, Organising in the Jewish Diaspora during a time of genocide. My name is Michael Edwards, and I'm part of the Jewish Council of Australia. Um, I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining this webinar from the unceded and sovereign lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to pay respects to past, present, and emerging elders, and acknowledge their care for this country, which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. But I also want to acknowledge the many First Nations lands from which you might be zooming in from today, right across this continent, but right across the world as well. So I'm going to say something briefly just to sort of set the scene for today's conversation and to introduce our three speakers, and say something about the format and how things will run. So today's conversation, I guess, really emerges from the fact and from the recognition that each day more and more Jewish people in communities right around the world, particularly over the last 2 years, but long before that as well, have been turning towards a Judaism that stands for justice and for freedom and for solidarity, and which supports Palestinian freedom and justice. So right across the diaspora, Jews are organizing, have been organizing, building new organizations, building new institutions that are fighting for our traditions and our communities and for a future where Jewish values are synonymous with justice for all, rather than being in lockstep support with the state of Israel. And today really is an opportunity to reflect on that work, especially over the last 2 years, but before that as well, to hear from organizers from across the Jewish diaspora, really, who have been working in solidarity with Palestinians, working in solidarity with other groups, to fight against Israel's genocide in Gaza, but also against occupation, against apartheid, against war crimes and human rights abuses perpetrated by the state of Israel. So it's really an opportunity, I think, not just to reflect on this work, but to ask some difficult questions about what's worked, what hasn't worked, to reflect perhaps on the failure of many of the legacy Jewish organizations in which, many of us came up. Maybe to reflect too on the concept of diaspora as a particular kind of orientation, as an idea, which I think grounds so much of our work, and to reflect on, many other things besides. So let me introduce our three speakers and then say something very brief about how the morning will work. So Morriah Kaplan, who's joining from New York, is the interim executive director of IfNotNow, a movement of American Jews organizing to end US support for Israel's apartheid system. She's an organizer on Israel-Palestine since 2009 and has also been IfNotNow's national spokesperson, and is also a frequent guest and contributor to international media, including in venues such as the BBC and Al Jazeera. Em Hilton, who's joining us from London, very late in London. Morriah's joining us from late in New York, but Emily's joining us from even later in London. Is a UK-based Jewish organizer who co-founded Naamod, British Jews Against Israeli Occupation. She sits on the advisory committee for the Centre for Jewish Nonviolence, has written extensively on anti-Semitism, on Israel-Palestine, and is also a founding staff member of an organization called Diaspora Alliance, which is something we'll talk a little bit about today as well. She's also, in a sense, one of us, having grown up here in Sydney. And then Sarah Schwartz is, as many of you here will know, the founding executive officer of the Jewish Council of Australia. She's also a human rights lawyer. She's worked across many fields in that space: protest rights, democratic freedoms, police accountability, prisoners' rights, and has written widely, like the others, on questions of Israel-Palestine, but also on policing and racism as well. So, with Morriah and Emily and Sarah, we're going to have for about the next 50 minutes a fairly loosely structured conversation, I hope. I'll ask some questions, and these are questions which draw in large part on some questions that you in the audience have submitted when you registered for the seminar. Um, and then we'll open things up for Q&A for about the last 20 minutes. So should be a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions at any point during the conversation, and then we'll gather some of those and discuss those for perhaps the last 20 minutes or so. And the aim really is to wrap up at 11:15 Sydney time. And that's not least to give people time to get to the nationwide protests for Gaza that are happening in cities right around this country. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that right at the end. So let's get stuck into it. What I wanted to do, just at least initially, I'm mindful that there'll be people in the audience who might know something about one of these three organizations, but not about the other two. So perhaps if I could ask the three of you to give a little bit of the backstory, to say something about the kind of the origin story of these three organizations, the impetus behind the establishment of these organizations in the respective communities where you're located, but also perhaps I'd love to hear something about what brought you personally into this work as well. Perhaps we can go in order of most egregious time zone. So maybe we can start with you, Emily, and then go Morriah, and then Sarah.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. It's really great to be here. Apologies in advance. I have a cold, so I'm a little bit um, clogged up. So apologies if I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so my name's Em, and I am a co-founder of Naamod. And Naamod really got set up basically. A number of us had gone through, I guess this is also part of my personal journey. A number of us had gone through a real sense of rupture with a lot of the Jewish community and institutions that we had initially felt very at home in, whether that be in these Zionist youth movements or in our synagogues. Um, or in sort of other communal organizations that we were working with or part of, around this sense of there seemed to be this commitment to equality and justice and progressive politics, except when it came to confronting the reality of Israel. And that what we could see in front of our eyes when we went to Israel Palestine, when we went to the West Bank, this reality of apartheid, of checkpoints, of blockades, of very clear racism, was just not really reflected in the commitment to justice and in the communities that we were part of. And this was becoming increasingly apparent um, over a number of years, and attempts to try and to challenge this was met with deaf ears or risk of isolation or ostracism from our communities. Um, and then in 2018, during the Great March of Return from Gaza, where protesters from Gaza marched towards the wall, separation wall, whatever you want to call it, 52 people were shot and killed in cold blood. And this was a moment that for a number of us, we were like, this cannot stand. We cannot have this happen. We cannot have soldiers wearing uniforms with Stars of David on them, shooting unarmed people as they march to the border to demand their freedom. We all know that very much so now how much of an open air prison Gaza is. And so a number of us got together and we decided to say Kaddish. We said, this we are here in outrage, not only as human beings, but also as Jewish people who've been told this one story about what Israel is. And now it seems to be such an anathema to these values that we hold. And so we gathered in Parliament Square in London and said Kaddish for the people who had been killed that day by Israel at the border. And we didn't actually really think much of this but at the time, like this right-wing Israel advocate came and he actually filmed the demo and put it on YouTube, and it became this huge scandal in the Jewish community in the UK. Like it was on the front page of the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News every single week, which was great because they're having to print things about the occupation every single week. And it really came from that moment where from that we also had other people start say they wanted to join us. And I think that's something that probably is very similar to Sarah and Morriah's experiences. When you actually create the space for these organizations, or for these spaces for people to come and like live out their values as Jews, where Israel is not the sort of exception to that. There is a real desire for that. And I think that's always been the case. You know, we have a lot of elders who've been talking about Palestine for decades. But I really think there's been something about this last 10, 15 years that has allowed a lot of this organizing to come to fruition. And I guess I would just say about myself and why I do this work, I think Israel's apartheid, this genocide, these are the biggest crisis. This is the biggest crisis facing Judaism today. There is nothing more urgent. There is nothing more rupturing and fracturing in this time for Jewish people as to how do we relate to this state that commits war crimes and atrocities day in, day out in our name, and how we rectify that. How do we save Judaism from Israel? I think is a huge question. But also, how do we as Jewish people um, live in the world and exist in the world and be part of a broader commitment to solidarity and human justice, and the ways in which Israel has separated and siloed us off from people who should be our natural allies. And I'm going to talk more about that, but I'll pause there. But that's really why I do this work, and I'm really grateful to be here with the JCA today to talk more about it.
Thanks, Em. Morriah, is it a similar kind of story for If Not Now? Of course, we're mindful that the kind of the
Yeah.
scale, just the sheer size of the Jewish community in the US, perhaps sort of creates a different set of dynamics. But I'd be curious to hear about that story
It is
too.
a very, I mean, the story has a lot of resonance. You know, the inciting incident for If Not Now was the summer of 2014, and the, you know, so-called Operation Protective Edge that killed 2,000 Palestinians and over 60 Israelis. Similarly, there was kind of wall-to-wall support for, you know, really pro-war rhetoric in most of the Jewish community, and a group of young people, you know, didn't stand outside Parliament. We stood outside the headquarters of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Institutions, which is a very old kind of legacy American institution that was founded by President Eisenhower to literally be the voice of Jews in Washington, which was obviously, you know, representing that Jews supported the war and supported the carnage. And so a group of young folks stood outside, wore black, said the Mourner's Kaddish. And it was posted online, and a bunch of similar actions popped up all over the country. It was very kind of easy and replicable to do. And it really, the energy that it created really demonstrated there was this widespread desire for a generational confrontation. It was a lot of young Jews, and initially, If Not Now, was very focused on organizing young Jews. We're still very focused on youth leadership because young people in particular have been disenfranchised from organized Jewish life, especially on this issue, you know, saying it's complicated, you don't understand, etc. And so, but, you know, has expanded to welcome Jews of all generations who, you know, want to organize on this issue, but really committed to organizing those institutions which are at the center of organized Jewish life in the American Jewish community, and demanding, not abandoning those institutions, but really demanding better of them. In terms of my story, I was one of those young people who grew up in these institutions, Jewish day school, summer camp, youth group, youth programs in Israel, and saw, as Em said, you know, the reality on the ground, heard, you know, the incoherence of what I had learned about Jewish values and then what I was learning about, you know, what was actually happening, were conflicting. And at a certain point, you know, was tracking, like right before 2014, with the Kerry peace talks, you know, it seemed like there was maybe going to be a kind of breakthrough. The peace process for so long, everyone had kind of pinned their hopes on a peace process. And then at a certain point, you know, that falling apart, and really, you know, in my early 20s, stopped believing in the, you know, the adults, the so-called leaders of the Jewish community to kind of fix this, to correctly identify and deliver us from occupation, apartheid, and now genocide. And so I joined If Not Now soon after its founding. I've been involved ever since. And And I think that informs not just, why this issue, but also why a group like IfNotNow and really protest politics, by organizing young people, we are definitionally organizing the grassroots, because the ways that young people have been disenfranchised from leadership, and really believing that, the grassroots, that grassroots organizing is what we need to transform our communities, our people, and ultimately our institutions.
Mm. Thanks, Morriah. I mean, Sarah, obviously our organization is a lot more recent, and I think there are certain resonances with things that Em and Morriah said. But could you say a bit about, how we came into being, and also your own sort of journey into this work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really thankful to be here with you, Emma Morriah, and to all the people who are here today on a Sunday morning. So yeah, obviously we had a different start to IfNotNow and Naamod in many ways. I think in some ways we did things in reverse. So as probably most people here know, we formed in this moment of genocide in February 2024, which kind of seems like a lifetime ago now. But we formed really as a group of people who were committed to Palestinian freedom and justice, wanted to do everything that we could to end the genocide. And I'll speak a little bit more about how we came together. But really, we were thinking in that moment, what can we do immediately, given our particular positionalities and roles as academics, as lawyers? How do we sort of use our positions as Jews in this very moment to affect Australian government policy in relation to the genocide? And so we sort of almost formed backwards in some ways, in that we felt like there wasn't actually time to build, this grassroots loud base, and also acknowledging that there were many other organizations who were doing that work around the country. We have had organizations doing work, protest groups and other Jewish groups in on Gadigal country, in Naarm, in Melbourne, where I live, in lots of different places. There were already these groups that existed, but what really didn't exist was a public Jewish voice in the media and political space that was needed to sort of break this narrative that had become very pervasive in Australia, and I know is pervasive in the US and the UK as well, where the entire Palestinian liberation movement is positioned as being in opposition to the Jewish community. And so we have headlines in Australia, I think less so now, maybe since we were created, but very common to have headlines in Australia with XYZ Jewish leaders, maybe 10 of them, all speaking out against the Palestine solidarity movement. And we saw that as not only just, it's not just that we created this organization as this vanity project to show that that was untrue, that actually there were diversity of views within the Jewish community, but we saw that that narrative was being used really destructively to silence Palestinian voices, to label them as anti-Semitic, to smear them. We already in that moment of February saw people being fired from their jobs for supporting Palestine, saw people not being willing to speak out because of this fear that if they did, they'd be going against the entire Jewish community. And so we really felt like it was our responsibility as Jewish people in that moment to speak out in that media and political space, and to do that advocacy work, both internally within institutions, but also externally within the media, which has obviously got us into a lot of trouble in the same types of way that Em and I know IfNotNow has also faced, but to actually put ourselves on the line in those ways, that being seen as really important, and also being seen by our Palestinian allies as being really important in that moment. I think then what we found, and we can speak a bit more about this, is that we couldn't actually just be an advocacy organization. And so our journey is almost a flip of, I think, the journeys of IfNotNow and Naamod, in that we very soon realized that we couldn't have any legitimacy in the media and political space if we didn't have a really solid base of people behind us, and a solid base of Jewish people. And not only that, I think almost immediately when we launched, as Em said, once you create the space, people come. We were like flooded. Our inboxes were absolutely flooded with Jewish people who wanted to join up and find ways to get involved. And we really, have struggled to build the organization as we go. We're a group of volunteers. We all have full-time jobs. Many people have children. So we've sort of tacked on different ambitions along the way. But I think we've really, our focus has really shifted as an organization to continuing to do that advocacy, which I think is really crucial, being that public Jewish voice, but also doing that organizing on the ground and building the base that we need to support our movement going forwards. And I guess just to say just a tiny bit about me, because it feeds, and then I'll stop speaking, a little bit into the Jewish Council's journey. I wasn't someone that really thought that I would be a public spokesperson in relation to Israel-Palestine. I grew up in probably similar environments, I think, to Em and Morriah. Went to a Jewish day school, was involved in a lot of Jewish cultural institutions, went to Israel many times as a young person. And really only I think my journey in relation to Zionism and Palestine began at university when I became more involved in left-wing spaces. So I think, as Michael mentioned, I've been involved in a lot of different activists and left-wing spaces and the First Nations justice movement and other, refugee movements. And I think it started to become very apparent through that work that I couldn't hold Israel out as an exception. And I couldn't not see the parallels between, First Nations justice here and Palestinian justice. And so for me, there was that slow learning. And then I guess in the wake of the genocide, I felt like I had to do more and be more visible. I spoke at a Jewish rally for a ceasefire organised by a group called the Loud Jew Collective in November 2023. I think when for many of us the signs of genocide had become abundantly clear and people were ringing the alarm bells, I felt like I couldn't just be on the sidelines any longer. I had to use my position in whatever way I could. That speech that I gave at that rally received a huge amount of backlash, including from within the Jewish community that I grew up in. And, apart from being really awful at the start and provoking a reckoning for me, that really propelled me to move forward. I connected with a lot of other Jewish people from my year group at high school, for example, who wanted to do more. And it made it, I was able to connect with other people in the Jewish Council. And that's kind of part of our genesis, is that we all came together during this moment. So yeah, that moment of backlash, I guess, really propelled me forward in many ways. But I'll end there.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, I think we've already sort of raised a lot of things I want to talk about, not least about the kind of the relation between our organizations and sort of existing Jewish institutions and how we see our work in connection to them. But maybe, Morriah, I'd love to hear from you as given that IfNotNow has been around for some time and has, obviously predated this current genocide, even as this genocide is in many ways an extension of many of the trends and processes and structures which were already very much in place and have been in place for decades in Palestine. I'd love to hear about whether the scale, the visibility, the sort of shifting global politics around Israel-Palestine during these last 2 years of genocide, whether that has changed the work of IfNotNow in any ways, or has just kind of meant that you've kind of just recommitted or doubled down on particular things you were doing already?
Yeah. I would say just about everything has changed in the past 2 years, in many ways. One, I mean, the issue has just gotten so much more visibility, and became, Israel-Palestine was sometimes in the news before then. The summer before October 7th took place, the U.S. Secretary of State said something like it was the quietest it's been in years in the territory. Obviously not true. There's death and destruction ongoing, death, dispossession, oppression for Palestinians every day. But there was this sense, people have found it easy to forget about it various times. And basically after October 7th, it was became very mainstream. Many people who had not thought about it before, maybe were active on other progressive issues, maybe weren't active at all, became involved. And all of our movements have grown tremendously since then. And it's just a much more kind of mainstream issue. If in the 2020 US presidential elections, IfNotNow really worked to kind of inject it into the conversation around the elections, policies like conditioning aid. That's not something we have to do anymore. It's unavoidable topic. And I think it's changed, so it's changed our organizing in the sense that the scale has changed of our organizing. There's also a lot of new groups and formations, like I think the JCA is a great example, that have popped up since, October 7th, which also, which I think fundamentally is a good thing. There's more groups in the ecosystem, more people, more strategies, more people trying new things, more opportunities for collaboration. And I think, at the same time, there's a lot of polarization. And the map shifted in many ways after October 7th. There were folks, I kind of like understood where certain people were, the various political alignments. And, there were maybe folks who felt like we were really close, we were working with more, we were really close to, seeking alignment on something. And then afterwards, everything kind of shifted. So there's been a lot of remapping and rebuilding of relationships. And I think for us also a recommitment to organizing in in affiliated American Jewish spaces, become really clear. It's very obvious to us that if we had enough people and enough power, we would have won. And so we clearly don't. And so we need to grow the camp. And so that's kind of where we've doubled down on our commitment. And especially, not just mobilizing the people who are already with us, which, we did for a while after in the, weeks and months following October 7th, but really trying to bring more people to join, because I think, there are a lot of people who have not had to confront this issue before now have to confront it. And I think that is a good thing. And there's a lot of ripe opportunities for organizing as a result.
Do you see similar things in Britain in the sense of a kind of a growing recognition, awareness, kind of coming to consciousness within the Jewish community? And has Naamod kind of responded to that in particular ways?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I think I would agree with a lot of what Morriah said. I think there's some other things that I would add. The first is just like also that this moment was deeply shattering in many ways as well, in terms of I think just um it is conversely like Naamod tripled in size with the largest Jewish anti-apartheid movement in Europe. We had, mass mobilization of Jews coming to the Palestine marches every week. We have had national recognition in a way that like was much harder for us to break through, probably similar as to Australia. In the sense that there's a very strong legacy Jewish organizational sort of representational politics narrative in the UK. And I think that it's, you can now just not say that all Jews support Israel in the UK. It's just not feasible anymore. There's just been such a pushback against that. And Naamod and other organizations have been instrumental in making sure that that's the case. And at the same time, I don't want us to sort of lose sight of the sort of the toll of this time. I think we haven't won in many ways. We failed, and I think that we should be able to hold that alongside these conversations about what we've done. Is that I think there is like a question for me moving forward is how do we build that power? And as Morriah said, some of that is going to be having to build broader coalitions to push that forward. But I think that has been, I think this has been it's been a very difficult, obviously, for so many, obviously, first and foremost, Palestinian communities, but I think also in terms of seeing the ways in which I feel like we have watched many parts of the Jewish community actually not come to our side, but dig in terms of their willingness to either turn away from what is very clearly genocidal destruction in Gaza or jump to defend what is inherently indefensible. And I think that is something that, we have also seen this polarization to that side where whilst we have had, I think, like there is like a lot of Jewish people who are going through this reckoning and have gone through this reckoning over the last 2 years. There was also many who frankly took too long to get there, or really chose to defend and support. And we see that continuously. I think particularly the things that were very distressing for me to see that was around the sort of this forced starvation that we saw in Gaza and the unwillingness even of our communities to sort of say that is not acceptable. So I think it's an interesting time. I think what I will say though is that there is a huge appetite, I think particularly within like other Palestinian groups in the UK to like work with Jewish groups and like build that Jewish Palestinian solidarity. And obviously that's delicate because Palestinians shouldn't always have to be talking about this issue in relation to Jewish people or Jews or even Israelis, etc. But I think that actually solidarity has been really important. Naamod has been pretty instrumental in building some of that in the UK, which has been very positive. But yeah, it's a mixed bag, but I do think we are living through something particularly historic. This rupture really is happening, and I think it is increasingly clear that from over the last 2 years, that supporting Israel, supporting Zionism, whatever obviously lots of different people in our communities have those positions on Zionism, but in terms of what it looks like in reality right now, that is becoming an extreme position. And I think that's a huge shift. And we can take a lot of that persuadable middle with us through a shared values and shared alignment. And I think that's something that we've really learnt over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Em. Yeah, there's two things you said that I want to come back to. One is about how we act in relation to what you just described as that persuadable middle. And then also what you said about Palestinians should not have to kind of always, be in sort of or discuss Palestine, discuss the genocide, of course, in sort of reference to Jewishness or to Jews or to anti-Semitism, and the need to push back against that kind of implicit demand or expectation. But I just want to stay a little bit with this kind of question about maybe strategy and organizing models. So Morriah, you've made it clear that for IfNotNow, sort of working within the sort of organized Jewish community is really, really important. I'd be curious to know, Em, is that kind of part of, or how does Naamod sort of see its relationship to kind of organized Jewish institutions? And I say that because I think, at the Jewish Council, as Sarah made clear in her answer to the previous question, this is still something we're very much sort of thinking about in real time. And I think our organizing model is kind of evolving. It's evolving in relation to building within the Jewish community and also in relation to kind of advocacy outside the Jewish community. But yeah, how does Naamod sort of think about these things?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I would say is there's a difference between the people who run those institutions and the people who have like a vested political interest in those institutions maintaining their power, whether that be within the community, whether that be in relation to like what relationships they have with government, etc. And the people who might, go to those institutions because that's just what they know. And I think that that's why it's really important. And Naamod has always had this of like, let's build alternatives. What is the alternative that we can offer people? If you want people to jump, you need to give them something to jump onto. And I think particularly in communities like in the UK, where Israel has become such a central tenet of Jewish life for various reasons, for numbers of years, you need to give, what is the alternative Jewish position? What is the alternative Jewish community you can offer them? And that's why it's also, I think it's really important as Jewish people, when we're organizing our own communities, like to have a sense of what Judaism looks like beyond Zionism, beyond Israel, beyond this moment. What if Palestine is free, what does it mean to be Jewish after that is something I often ask people who are a bit more sort of like only on the Palestine side of this in my community. And I think that these things are really important to be talking about because I think we give a lot of power to these institutions also to only just be in opposition to them. I think that when we're constantly just being like, they're illegitimate, they suck, they're bad, they're racist. Absolutely, that's all true often. But I think we also have to be like, what are we actually for now? Like, what does liberatory Jewish politics look like in 2025? What does it mean to be Jewish now? What does it mean to have Torah and Hagim and life and community and culture that is sort of actually free from the sort of problematic ideals of these communities or this problematic Israel stuff, but what does it actually mean to also just be Jewish? And so I think that's been something that Naamod has really held. We have a big community-based organizing space, not just in terms of like political organizing, but we always do stuff with the Hagim. We do things around, community events and education and book club and various things that also give people a space to go to. And I think that, often people, you might go to the Jewish community appeal dinner because you just know your friends are going to be there. So where can you have that something that your friends go to that's different? And I think particularly when I think about people of my parents' generation who just feel like they don't really have folks to talk to when they're wrestling through this stuff, I think often one of the roles that we can also play as Jewish people helping other Jewish folks on this journey is like, we should have these hard conversations because actually some of this is our own stuff, rather than that being sort of either put onto Palestinians or like that needs to be sort of negotiated or debated in the public sphere. Like actually some of this stuff is us just taking care of our own, one of a better term, psychodrama here. And I think that that's like, and I think it's really important. And, you know, a lot of us were given this off ramp. A lot of us were given the opportunity to wrestle with these questions and with patience and an understanding. Like I did not come out like I was a Zionist, I was a liberal Zionist, I was on all those journeys, and I was given space by people to learn and grow and shift my political beliefs. And I think that if we actually want to win, we can't just be focusing on those who are already with us. We need to want to move people. That's what it means to organize people, is to move them onto your side. And so that means, I think, whether or not it's about being in these legacy institutions versus holding the space for others to come and join us, I think is a different question. But yeah, I think that's what I would say in terms of sort of our relationships with these institutions.
Yeah, thanks. Sarah, you know, Em just mentioned that much of this work is about sort of thinking through with community, kind of what it means to be Jewish in this moment. And I'd be curious, well, actually to hear from all of you, but maybe you first, Sarah, about the kind of the place of diaspora in that, whether in, you know, our conception of Jewishness, sort of diaspora plays a kind of a central role. It's obviously in the title of this webinar and in so much that we think about, but how does it sort of shape our politics or our ethics, or our sort of relationship to Jewishness itself, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. And I really love what you said, Em, about building alternative institutions. And I think that that's something we've been talking a lot about at the Jewish Council and giving people space. And I want to give a shout out to Ohad Kosminski, who is basically our community organizer at the Jewish Council, who's been coordinating discussion groups all around the country, because we realized really quickly, based on, you know, similar to what you said, Em, if we're going to ask people to jump, we need to have these conversations within the Jewish community about what Judaism looks like. We need people to be able to ask each other questions and have those hard conversations. And so, yeah, we thought that holding, you know, connecting people in their local areas to having local discussion groups was like a really good way for us to be able to do that while still, you know, just being a small group of volunteers. So I think that's probably one of the best things that we've done as an organization. But yeah, and I think that ties a little bit into diasporism and how we think about that. So, you know, I think we get painted a lot as you know, probably all three of our organizations as being, you know, in opposition to the mainstream Jewish community, as only having an identity that is in conflict, in opposition. And I think similar to the term diaspora, people often think of that term as meaning that we're talking about an exile position, or we're talking about our relationship to Israel, this sort of deficiency. But I think to us and to so many other Jewish thinkers, you know, see diaspora as this positive, generative form of collective life, that is, you know, about creating communities where Jewish people can flourish, you know, trans-globally around the world, without a nation state, that it's actually about our connection to the place where we are as Jewish identity. You know, a lot of different writers write about this. Daniel Boyarin, Judith Butler, and even the Bundes, you know, speak about these ideas of Jewish culture and identity as having been portable, you know, us existing in the places where we are. And I think that that's really fundamental to how we see ourselves at the Jewish Council. And I just want to, you know, briefly mention our name, because I think some of our name speaks to that. You know, a lot of people see our name, and we have copped a lot of flack for our name. It's probably one of the most consistent pieces of criticism we get. You know, you've called yourself this very broad name. You should be calling yourselves Jews for Palestine. Why have you called yourselves the Jewish Council? It's grand, blah, blah, blah. And I think for me, you know, apart from the fact that our name has some historical resonances to a previous Jewish organization that existed in Australia of a similar name, which had a lot more mainstream support than we currently had, and saw its identity, you know, in a similar way to diasporism as connected to the place here, to solidarity with other oppressed groups, not in relation to the state of Israel, saw Judaism as that form of solidarity. Apart from that, I also think that our name is a provocation in many ways. It's a provocation about what it means to be a Jewish organization. In the future, I don't want Judaism to only be defined in relation to this genocidal apartheid state that exists over here exists over there to oppress Palestinians. I want Judaism to be seen, and I want to fight for a Judaism that is about solidarity, justice, celebrating our traditions in the form of liberation. And just to tell one small story about that, in my work with First Nations communities here, I've worked a lot with families who've lost loved ones in custody and have sort of experienced the coalface of the genocide that occurred in this country and the dispossession and colonization that occurred in this country. And I've had lots of conversations with clients and mob here about who I am, and because I always get asked, and speaking about what it means to be Jewish. And so many First Nations people that I speak to reference William Cooper, First Nations activist here, who stood with the Jewish community when the Jewish community was experiencing the Holocaust, and who advocated for the Australian government to take in more Jewish people. And they reference that because they see our communities and that connection in terms of solidarity, which is why I want for our community to be a community that is invested in that form of diasporism, that sees ourselves in this place, connected to other communities in this place, in solidarity. So I see that as like really, really core to our work.
Morriah, obviously, you know, the Jewish community in the US, it's a much older, not just a much bigger, but a much older community. In Australia, it's largely a community that emerges from Holocaust survivors. So I imagine that the diaspora dynamics there are different, though, of course, it is, like Sarah just mentioned, about this place, also a settler colony. So there is that kind of context to it as well. But how do you think about sort of diaspora as a particular orientation for, I guess,
I
in
mean,
particularly in this moment?
yeah, I mean, much of what Sarah said really resonates. I mean, I think, yes, it's um, the American Jewish community certainly predates the emergence of political Zionism and the state of Israel. And yet, at this moment, much of organized Jewish life is geared towards Israel, and Israel is kind of a central um, pillar of Jewish life. And I think, as you said, Sarah, diaspora is sort of considered like a position, like a lack or a deficit, a place that we are not. And I think to us it means, as Sarah said, really investing in the places that we are. I'll share one. In 2023, in December of 2023, Joe Biden, in defense of the genocide, said, "Without Israel, there's not a Jew in the world who would be secure." And to us, diaspora means the opposite of that, and to reject that. Jews everywhere deserve to be secure. Our leaders, no matter where we live, have a responsibility to protect us. Jews deserve to lead thriving lives, have rights to a democracy, be connected to our neighbors wherever we are. And part of the dynamic of what's happening in this country is, Jews and others, Jews, we refuse to be kind of sold down the river, used as pawns in order to perpetuate a highly militarized ethno-state, which doesn't make its citizens safer either, certainly not Jews anywhere else in the world. And so I think, I mean, Sarah really said much of what I believe is true and how we relate to diaspora as well, investing in multiracial democracy where we live. And I think also means embracing the diversity of what Jewish life looks like around the globe and rejecting this idea of a global Jewish monoculture, which I think, or, monolithic way of being Jewish, which I think is so dangerous.
Thanks. What about you, Em? How do you see diaspora, and particularly as someone with experience in sort of different diasporic communities here and over there in London.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think a lot of the stuff that Sarah and Morriah said really resonates with me. I think like maybe a slightly a shift in some maybe some this what's would be different for me to talk about is the ways in which I feel like often actually a lot of the conversation around Israel in diaspora Jewish communities or Jewish communities around the world concern safety and security. And that's really the question that people are asking is like, what do we do if there's no Israel? And I think there's a few different threads there that are important to pull out. I think one is that, we are living through a time not historically, globally, of deep crisis of democracy, where minority communities and minoritized and marginalized communities around the world um, are being targeted. Some have always been targeted throughout history. I'm really thinking about what you said, Sarah, and your story about working with First Nations folks. I think this is a time where, Jewish people do not have a unique claim to wanting to feel safe and secure. This is something that everyone has a right to feel. Um, and that like even if for me like even if Israel actually did in some way keep Jewish people safe, I think we know that we know that clearly that isn't true, evidently over the last 2 years. But even if it did, the moral cost, frankly, is just too high. We don't have a unique exceptional claim to that safety. It's something that has to be bound up with everyone, and Palestinians also deserve safety too. And I think that that's, we can't guarantee that security anymore. Like we are not living, we're very much living through a time in which sort of the ideas that we thought were going to keep us safe or keep the world together are rapidly falling apart. And so I think that's one piece. But I think the other thing is just that, there's a this sense of like what would it mean to be in a moment in which actually we were all free? What would collective liberation look like? And I think it is just this sense that we are not constantly pulling ourselves apart, trying to square the circle of Israel's reality with what it means to be Jewish now,
Mm.
and that we would have this thriving sense of what it meant. And it wouldn't even mean that you could go and be like, it would be like formally like an anti-Zionist community or whatever. It would just be like, I'm just a Jewish person in the world, and this is what I do, and
Mm.
this is my community, this is how I
Mm.
am. And the right had been very effective at forcing a conversation of like the way you are a good Jewish person is if you support Israel. And I think progressives and the left and progressives have to be better at being like us defining what we see as like what does it mean to be a Jew in the world. And I think that's the conversation and the work within our own communities now.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, on that question of the work, I think we've all kind of mentioned in different ways that I think it's fair to say that our organizations haven't always been welcomed by a set of kind of legacy establishment Jewish organizations, and obviously the sort of the ecosystem of those Jewish organizations that looks different in these three different contexts. But I would be curious to know about how you respond to the critique that often comes from those organizations or people kind of affiliated with them that organizations like ours, Jews like us, really are fringe, are marginal, are so kind of tiny and radical that we don't even warrant being listened to. Obviously, that's a bad faith critique, but maybe start with you, Sarah. Like, is that a critique that's worth responding to? In what way? And then that ties back to what Em said earlier about this sort of persuadable middle. I mean, how important is bringing over more people into our organizations or into the communities we're building that are sort of adjacent to our organizations as a kind of response to that critique, or how important is that even, or should we just kind of ignore that?
I mean, I guess just starting with the last part, I don't think as the left we can give up on anyone. And I think as Morriah said, we want to be able to win. We want to be able to have safety and liberation for everyone. And that requires bringing people along. And when I think of this question, I often go back to my younger self. Because, like I think Em and Morriah, I didn't start off as having the positions that I now have in regard to Israel. I didn't see Palestinian history. I didn't know about the Nakba. I often think of what I would have done in high school if, yeah, what, my positions then and how much they have changed. For me, I think the reason that it took me so long to speak up publicly is because of the very silencing within the Jewish community of voices such as ours. And we've seen this in forming the Jewish Council, just the amount of resources that are expended by our legacy organizations to try to silence our voices. And this is the main tactic that is used, I think, within the Jewish community to try to keep everyone in line and to try to, enforce this pro-Israel orthodoxy within our communities. And we see this in the way that I think Jews who speak out are made examples of. And I think that in some, that's happened to people historically. I grew up and I heard stories of a prominent Jewish person who's on our advisory committee, Anthony Lowenstein, who wrote a book called My Israel Question, questioning his relationship to Israel. And I think was sort of the subject of maybe Jewish news articles every single day, or at least every week. He was really vilified by the Jewish community. And in the same way, the Jewish Council as well, we are constantly in the Jewish news. I think if there is a month that goes by where we're not called some horrific name in the Jewish news, we're like, oh, what's happening? It's a very quiet week for us. And in the Australian context as well, the right, and I'm sure that this is true as well in your context, the right side of politics has control and has a lot of influence over a particular set of papers, the Murdoch Press, owned by Rupert Murdoch, same as Fox News in the US. And so there has been an ability for right-wing Jewish institutions to vilify myself, to vilify others, to run really coordinated smear campaigns against myself and others within those Murdoch media institutions, and to also run vilifying campaigns against Palestinians, I should say. And I guess I should preface all of this by saying I think that Palestinians are the ones who are vilified the most by pro-Israel Zionist institutions. It is not a coincidence that in Australia, every single Palestinian academic, I think every single prominent Palestinian academic has been so vilified, and has faced real consequences. And I'm thinking of Randa Abdel Fattah, the sort of witch hunt against her by Zionist organizations, because she is an articulate Palestinian woman who stands steadfast for the liberation of her people. And so I don't want to suggest at all that Jewish people face that similar level of criticism. I think in many ways we're protected from some of that because of our identities. But also we have to see this sort of silencing campaign as part of the way in which pro-Israel institutions keep the Jewish community in line. And, I'm sure we all have stories of people saying that I would speak out publicly, I would do things, but I'm scared of how it's going to impact my family. I'm scared of how it's going to impact my job. It's not a coincidence that our signatory list is made up of a number of anonymous signatories because people are so scared of the consequences. And when people are scared of speaking up, that prevents people from not only speaking up publicly, but taking public actions and joining the movement. And so I think that it is incumbent on us to face into that reality of the silencing that occurs. I think the way that we do that, can be very different. And I'm really keen to hear about how you guys do that. But, I don't think that necessarily means that we're constantly responding to the barrage of times that we get called capos and these sort of concocted dreams that right-wing institutions have about us as being anti-Jewish and all of that. But I do think it's incumbent on us to try to speak to those people who are persuadable, who do see what's happening in Gaza, who see the starvation, who may even see the genocide, but are really scared of speaking up. I actually think there's a really sizable proportion of the Jewish community that is at that position, but have heard the vilification and seen the silencing that has occurred about groups like us and are really scared to join the movement. And so I think it's really incumbent on us as Jewish people to speak to those people in particular and bring them along, because the more space that we create, the more we open up, the more that people can say, oh, my friend, my family member is a member of the Jewish Council, is a member of Naamod, a member of IfNotNow. That means that Jews like me as an 18-year-old are not scared to speak up publicly, because I actually have friends who are also part of this movement, and I know that there's strength in numbers. So yeah, I'll end there.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful framing, Sarah. I mean, Morriah and Em, is that similar to how you kind of respond to these often bad faith kind of critiques? I mean, I'm conscious that the landscape is a little bit different. Obviously, the bigger institutional players, whether that's I don't know, the ADL or the Board of Deputies in the UK, as well as the media landscape, the Jewish Chronicle, or a much larger Jewish media landscape in the US. But is that similar to how you think about this or respond to it?
Morriah, go for it.
I mean, if we were to respond every time they said that, we wouldn't get much done. I think our response is in our organizing. Like we just respond by being bigger, by leading with values and demands that are popular, and by bringing more people to our side, by referencing the polling. Over 60% of American Jews support an offensive arms embargo to Israel. Over, I think, 40% of American Jews are calling it a genocide. We were founded in the tradition of mass movement building, and so that's always been our orientation, just to be majoritarian and popular, and make sure that as many people who want to be involved in IfNotNow can get involved in IfNotNow, and constantly having a kind of growth orientation. And I think also, Sarah, you mentioned astutely, like how much resource our opposition has, how much money they spend to bolster their own image, to make us look fringe. And I think it's worth remembering that they have to spend millions of dollars because what they are selling is unpopular. And we have to spend a lot less. We can out-organize them dollar for dollar because we are advocating for a vision that people want, a liberatory Judaism, that people you don't need to spend millions of dollars on ads convincing people that, all people are equal and deserve rights and dignity. So I will also say, in the US in the past few years, groups like AIPAC and the ADL have done a lot to sort of self-marginalize, like they kind of do our work for us in many ways. The ADL being apologists for like Elon Musk's Heil Hitler, AIPAC backing some incredibly backing insurrectionists in congressional elections. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's really our response, is just being as unmarginal and as popular as possible.
Mm. Thanks, Morriah. I'm mindful of the time. We're almost at the hour, but there are a few more things I want to get to. And there is another critique, which is certainly not a bad faith critique, actually, which is that particularly now in this moment of sort of extraordinary and unthinkable suffering for Palestinians, that this is not a moment to be centering Jewishness. And it's a critique that's made of our organizations. It's a critique that's made of the sort of the politics of Jewish anti-Zionism. And it's sort of often based in what is like just the fact that often it's the case that a Jewish critic of Israel or a Jewish anti-Zionist will have a platform that a Palestinian doesn't. And I'd be curious, maybe starting with you, Em, about how you think about that, how you think about or respond to that critique about whether there is a need to have organizations that are explicitly Jewish in this moment, and whether that could change.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think it really comes down to your strategy and what your goal is, I think. I think both in terms of and what the need is and what the need is that you're trying to fill organizing. So for example, if there is a sense that Jewish people, which we are used as a shield or justification for geopolitical inaction on Gaza. So whether that's the British government saying that they're going to continue to sell weapons because they want to support the British Jewish community, which they did. If we think of that as a pillar that upholds Israeli apartheid, genocide, occupation, then I think strategically it makes sense to build a Jewish base that says, no, we're not in our name. This is not true. This is not for Jewish people, and disrupt that narrative. I think that makes sense. I think there is obviously times in which if you're having I think that if you're having a broader conversation or political campaign around Palestinian freedom, you don't need to bring Jews in to be the spokespeople of that, obviously not. But this is really, for me, this is like an organizing question around power, strategy, goals. I think similarly with this conversation, if we think that there is value, both on like a political level and then on an internal communal level, to ensure that Jewish people are not seen as the pro-genocide community, then I think it makes sense to have Jewish groups going in and doing that work. Similarly, like maybe it's better that we have this conversation with our community than expecting Palestinians to do that work, et cetera, et cetera. So it's for me, I think that critique as an overarching thing, I think is a bit of honestly like childish leftism. I think this is about actually like what is your actual goal and how do we do that? Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to not be sensitive. Of course, we have to be sensitive to the ways in which our voices are uplifted, and there's practical things you can do for that. So, for example, you can say, "I'm not going to do this interview unless I can do it with a Palestinian co-organizer." You do actions that are co-led, or you do specific work. There's lots of different practical things you can do to challenge the sort of centering question. But I guess I think that sometimes that is something that is leveled because there's this sense of like how do we this issue feels so insurmountable, and this is a way to get control is to attack each other and critique each other. And one thing I just wanted to say, and I just want to share a story about my friend, and it actually came up in the last conversation because I think also, you know, for me, like in terms of thinking about these legacy organizations, I don't care about what they think. I care about my constituents, and like our opposition are always going to be active when we are active, and like, we just have to be better. And we have to organize our own resource and money, and you know, we need to make sure that our rabbis can speak out if they want to speak out. Like there's a lot of organizational work we have to do. But you know, when I think about that question around centering Jewishness, I think about my friend Auda Haflin, who is a Palestinian Bedouin activist in Morriah in the West Bank, who I've known since 2016 when I first went to Morriah. And he really saw the value and the importance in Jewish Palestinian organizing and solidarity and collective liberation. And Auda was murdered this past summer. He was shot by a settler trying to protect a water pipe from being cut off on his land. And you know, when I think about the sort of the costs and the challenges that we face, I think the reason I do this work is for him. And I think the most important thing we can be doing is thinking about how do we move forward to this collective liberation, to a time when Palestine is free. And the most important thing for us to be doing is thinking strategically, and building that collective future that we all deserve.
Terrific. Thanks, Em. I think there are a few questions already in the chat which kind of chime with some things that I wanted to talk about. So I think this is probably a good time to go to those. There are a few questions about, I guess, the sort of the practicalities, really. There's a question about what are the practical things your organizations do that work well to grow our base. Sarah, you mentioned Ahad's work with discussion groups. I think that's a really wonderful example of that. But I wonder if I can ask you to reflect a little bit on that. And then there's another question I think which connects to that, which is really for you, Em and Morriah, about whether your organizations ever considered, and I like this phrasing, infiltrating or commandeering existing institutions to tilt them further to the left, and sort of strategies around that. So maybe, so I guess, yeah, those two questions about practical things that we're doing, and maybe Morriah and Em first on that question of infiltrating and commandeering. Morriah, maybe you? Yeah.
And then Morriah,
Sure.
you go, and then I'll go. That's fine.
All right. The practical things we go are based. So really, like I hear interest in sort of the tactical level. So I think, as Em said, right, if you want people to jump, you have to give them something to jump to. So while we're not necessarily building, you know, alternative Jewish institutions, we do need to provide community for people, because if they're asking them, you know, to not participate, or they're actually actively grappling with the institutions that they're a part of, you know, they do need community. And often the risk of participating in this work, the biggest risk as Jewish people is risk to community and risk to relationships. And so providing opportunities for folks to be in community. So we do a lot of Shabbat dinners, we do Hanukkah parties, we, you know, and we have 9 chapters in cities across the US, which have various sort of constellations. You know, Jewish life and Jewish left infrastructure looks different in all of those cities. So in some cities there are really robust alternatives. In some cities, like IfNotNow is chapters are the one who are offering kind of the alternative Yom Kippur services. But, you know, we want to make it as easy as possible for people to get involved in IfNotNow. So that means making really clear pathways for So you're on the email list. You want to come to an event. After the event, you want to come to an introduction to IfNotNow call. Then you're going to get a one-on-one, like within a week or two. Then you're going to be invited into the chapter. You're going to be put on a team. You're going to get training. If you're in a congregation and interested in organizing in your synagogue, you're going to become part of the network of folks who are all thinking about that question. So I think the funnel of engagement, as we think about it, is a really critical part of making sure that's kind of an unbroken chain, so that people, the steps are always provided for them to get involved. And they can also stop at any point on that ladder. They don't need to be the most involved in order to be involved, and making sure that there's just an array of different ways for people to be connected and take action. On the question of infiltration, it's such a great question. I mean, part of the nature of Jewish geography is like, even in, a Jewish community like in the US, which is quite large, like we all kind of know someone who's in some, who works for like Hillel International or used to work for the Jewish Federation or whatever. And there is an interconnectedness that we don't need to necessarily try so hard for. But we've talked about less infiltration, more like, should we really be trying to support people to get onto their synagogue boards more? We're obviously working in synagogues. Well, I shouldn't say obviously. We're organizing in synagogues. We're doing so less through a mindset of infiltration and more organizing. But I think the other thing, it's a question about where power sits in those institutions, and oftentimes line staff at those institutions don't have a lot of power anyways, and even the leaders of those institutions are really beholden to a donor class. So I think it's also a question of like where you see and locate power, and our strategy is always very grassroots. So, I think the extent to which we think about infiltration, so to speak, would be reaching new constituencies, new segments of Jewish life in order to organize them. Although I love the idea of, being a mole on the inside.
Sarah, Em,
I think I was just going to say, in terms of more practical tips, I think this is also where, like, if you do an action, making sure there's a meeting arranged for straight after the action, not on the day, but like within the week, that people can come to and hear more about what you guys are doing, or like, there's a lot of these tips that, from an organizing perspective, having a campaign, people understanding exactly how they can plug into the campaign, etc. And I think particularly in places perhaps with less, like Naamod is basically full volunteers. So when it's in context in which there is no paid staff, like having a sense of like, how do you have a mechanism which people can hop in and then maybe hop back out again, and there's other people to replace them. What is the model for that? Trainings are great also to get everyone along a unified message as well, and have a sense of what you're for and also what you're not for. So these are the things we believe, these are things we don't believe. If you believe these things, you can be part of JCA, etc. And I totally echo it, like community events, and some of my best friends have come out of Naamod without question. And it just happens when you're doing that work, you can build that. And I think on the point of infiltration, I agree. I think it's also in places like the UK, where the communities are small, they just know who we were and they know what we're doing. Like, it just wouldn't work, And I imagine that's probably similar in Australia. I do think that there's value in having groups in places like synagogues, potentially, or youth movements, or wherever, where you are trying to disrupt some of the traditional power structures. And some of that is about, I think, organizing donors and talking to people and having very serious conversations with donors who are maybe a bit more liberal but a bit nervous, and sort of saying, like, which side of this do you want to be on? Like, this is the point. In 20 years everyone's going to say they were part of the JCA, 30 years whatever. You could do that now, I think, is like an important point. But I think the second thing is also, in the UK we had a rabbi who is at a very mainstream Masorti synagogue, and they wrote in it's like a supplement, like a halachic left supplement. They said they called the Israeli government war criminals. And they were new to the synagogue, and they were young and queer and non-binary. And there was this campaign in the synagogue to get them fired by sort of older right-wing donors, mostly. And because there were so many young people who also went to the synagogue and people who were there, they were actually able to organize a huge amount of support for this person. And that, I think, is like a really good example of, like, actually there is value sometimes in staying in these institutions. I just think that sometimes the goal what can sometimes be obscured is sometimes the goal being like, we just want these institutions to be better. And it's like, no, we don't, we want to shift the whole system, you know?
Mm,
So it's just about managing that.
mm.
But, there's definitely value in having people who can support people who are critiqued or whatever. But I think it just depends.
Sarah, I mean, I guess in addition to the discussion groups, which I said, it's such a terrific example of this, and I think it's done so much work for us in building community. But are there other practical things that you think we've done, or we should do, or we're planning to do?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's like our main focus at the moment, like thinking about how we build our membership. And for those who don't know, who are listening in, we're currently doing a supported drive at the moment, trying to get more Jewish people to sign on to our signatory list. I know that we have a lot of non-Jewish supporters as well. We really see our role as trying to bring on board more Jewish people and taking that responsibility as a Jewish organization as well, to have those conversations within our community. We have the ability for allies to sign on to our supporter list as well. But Jewish signatories who join on and allies as well have access to, a range of events that we hold specific to the Jewish community. Training, we're doing like political education webinars. And so we're trying to build that base. I guess just speaking a little bit about the institutional landscape here, because I think we're maybe a little bit different from the US in particular, maybe more similar to the UK. And I loved what you said, Morriah, about distinguishing, and I think Em, you mentioned this too, about distinguishing between the leadership of these institutions and the base. I think we can't ignore the fact that in this moment in Australia, our legacy Jewish organisations have not only supported a genocide to the hilt, but are siding and actively siding with the far right, who hate Muslims, who hate all the groups that we want to stand in solidarity with, queer people, who are doing so much damage throughout the world. I see within our community now, we have this far right group called the AJA, Australian Jewish Association, who posts openly Islamophobic content, who openly supports settler violence, who supports this expansionist view of Israel and the colonization of the Middle East. And they are now partnering with mainstream Jewish organisations, like the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. We have collaborations between far-right groups and our main representative Jewish organisation, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, who, like the ADL, defended Elon Musk's Nazi salute. So we have within these institutions, and I see, like, it devastates me because I grew up within a lot of these institutions. I feel so betrayed by them. I feel so betrayed by so many of the rabbis that I grew up with who still have not spoken out. But we know that there are congregations and rabbis who are moving towards thinking about speaking out. And so I think it's really important for us to work with those institutions to create more space. But I totally agree with what Emma and Morriah said, and I think this is what we're thinking a lot about at the Jewish Council. How do we create our own institutions? I think it's really important that we stay a volunteer-led organization at the Jewish Council, and we stay at that grassroots level, that we not sort of become this professional body that is disconnected from its membership, that we stay connected. But we have to think about how we're structured in order to give people avenues to get involved. And that's something that, we've kind of been chasing our tail a lot. And I think that that's like our biggest task ahead, is creating those pathways for people to get involved in the Jewish Council, to feel like they are members of our organization, to feel like they can go out into their synagogues and youth movements and recruit, and to feel like they can create those alternative spaces. Something that we've noticed at the council, which is interesting, I'm not sure is reflected in your context, but when we started, I actually think our membership skewed older. We had a lot of older people coming to our events and more interested in sort of the academic discussions that we were hosting. And then the moment we started hosting more chagim and ritual events, we started having more young people come on board. And I think that that's where so many young Jewish people are feeling so betrayed, like me, with their Jewish institutions, with their synagogues. They want to feel connected to their Jewishness. They want to feel a sense of Jewishness. And so I think for us, the future involves creating those institutions, creating that sense of community so that people can move over. And so we have a space, for organizing, for political action, but also for people to just be Jewish as part of our institutions, be Jewish, in a way that is liberatory, that is, that advocates for safety for all, that is connected to our core traditions of justice. I think that that's really important for us.
So I think we have time for one more question, and there's a question in the chat from Ahmed, which chimes with something I wanted to ask. I mean, maybe particularly to you, given your work with not just Naamod but Diaspora Alliance. And it's this question: how can collaboration and coordination be consolidated, you know, across organizations like ours, between different national contexts? You know, I'm mindful, you know, your work with DA, you know, you're thinking with, you know, Jewish communities in Argentina and Brazil and in continental Europe. And I think it's often the case that for many of us, you know, we really do look towards the US, and that's for obvious reasons, you know, the significance of the US geopolitically, and just the strength of, I guess, Zionist lobbying organizations there. But yeah, maybe, Em, could you say a little bit just to kind of close us out? Because this does strike me as a kind of an unusual kind of trans diasporic conversation that I personally really appreciate. And I imagine it's the kind of thing that you're trying to do more of it at the Diaspora Alliance.
Yeah, totally. And I think you know, also in terms of our own personal story, the reason that Naamod even exists is because I went to Palestine with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence and met people who'd set up IfNotNow and JVP and like, and also some folks from the Australian Jewish Democratic Society. I'm not sure if that still exists, but you know, really that sense that, you know, that you can have these moments where you're able to learn from each other and grow and strategize. And I think this is a particularly important conversation because we know right now that the far right and the right across the world are, somewhat ironically, thinking very internationally, working across borders, sharing the same strategies and resources and talking points. And that's why we're seeing this growth of like far right organizations all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. So I think not only is it a good idea for us all to be talking, we have an obligation and a responsibility to actually also be thinking across borders and strategically. Um, and there's lots of different ways to do that. I think, you know, there's both like international campaigns, there's continuing, I think, to meet and learn and work together and talk together, share ideas, share experiences, shares what worked, what hasn't. And we do a lot of that at DA. But also, I think in terms of, I guess, for the Australian context, you know, I imagine the Australian context is much more similar to the context of much smaller Jewish communities in Europe or the UK or in Latin America, where there's less resource and it's a bit more, I guess the mainstream is much more closed off, and there's less and that's not. I think actually there's also a lot to learn from the US context in terms of how you expand that. But I do think there's a lot of value, and I think the more we can be working together, you know, there's a lot of international right-wing Jewish organizations, whether that be the World Zionist Organization or whatever. We could create a Jewish progressive international Jewish organization too. Like, there's no reason why we have to cede this space. Um, and I also think, I think particularly at this time, you know, something that I imagine, you know, if we're talking about the personal transformation piece, you know, I think that there's a lot of pain, I think, that can come from going against your communities and having to unlearn things and be met with suspicion or frustration or disagreement and disappointment. And I think that actually something that I also found very valuable of doing this work is like meeting a lot of people who've also gone through this and having some shared compassion for each other and solidarity. And I think the reason that's important, both from like us as people needing that support, is also strategically, it helps us keep going. Like, I think knowing that we're not alone helps us keep going. And meeting other people who've experienced the same things as us and who understand the real importance of what it means to be Jew speaking out in this time, and knowing that we're kind of not just you know, that we're not going crazy, for a better word. I think it's really, really important. And I would be happy, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I'd be happy to continue to speak to the JCA and other folks who are going through these experiences. And I think as much as we can do that and hold each other in this time, it's really crucial.
Thanks, Em. So I did say at the start that we would finish a little bit early, and so we're at 20 past 11 at least here in Sydney. I mean 20 past midnight for you, and in London. But we are going to finish early, not least to give people time to get to what are nationwide protests for Gaza here in Australia. They're happening in cities right around the country, but they are starting in Melbourne at 12 at the State Library, and in Sydney at Hyde Park at 1. So thank you so much, Em and Morriah and Sarah, for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and yeah, for participating in this really wonderful diasporic conversation. So for those of you who are here in Australia, please do reach out, be in touch with us at the Jewish Council, get involved with all the many things which Sarah has spoken about, upcoming Hanukkah events, discussion groups. All that info is on our website. But for now, yes, thank you again, Em and Morriah and Sarah, and thank you everybody for coming, and have a great Sunday.
Thank you so much.